This move immediately opens lines for both the queen and the king's bishop, staking a claim in the center and preparing for rapid development. This move initiates the French defense, a solid and resilient opening where black prepares to challenge white's central pawn control with a flexible pawn structure. This move establishes central pawn control, challenging black's e6 pawn and preparing to develop pieces for kingside attack or central dominance. This move, 2, d5, directly challenges white's central pawn majority, initiating the French defense, and aims to create a dynamic pawn structure that can lead to both tactical and positional struggles for control of the center. This move develops the knight to a more passive square, avoiding immediate confrontation and aiming to support the d4 pawn while preparing for a potential c3 move to solidify the center. This move challenges white's central pawn presence directly, aiming to create an unbalanced pawn structure and open lines for active piece play, typical of sharp French defense variations. This capture opens the e-file and clarifies the central pawn structure, often leading to dynamic play characteristic of the Tarrasch defense or advance variation of the French defense. This pawn capture solidifies the pawn center and opens lines for piece development, aligning with the typical strategic goals of the French defense. This move develops the knight and supports the d4 pawn, preparing for further central development and maintaining a flexible pawn structure within the French defense framework. This move, a6, prepares to gain space on the queenside and potentially prevent white's b4 pawn push, a common idea in structures arising from the French defense. This move transitions from a French defense structure to an open Catalan setup, aiming to control the center and develop actively. This move develops a piece to an active square, recaptures a pawn, and opens a diagonal for the queen, which is a standard and logical response in this variation of the French defense. This move repositions the knight to a strong square where it can attack white's central pawn structure and prepare to challenge black's active bishop. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting the central pawn and preparing for potential counterplay on the queenside. This move develops the bishop to an active diagonal, preparing to castle and supporting the knight on b3, which controls important central squares. This move prepares to develop the kingside knight to its natural square, aiming to support the d5 pawn and potentially reroute to f5 or g6 for more active play. Castling kingside solidifies the king's safety and prepares to connect the rooks, facilitating an active role for the remaining pieces in the center. This move develops the knight to a more active square, preparing to contest the center and potentially support a pawn advance in the future. This move prepares to reinforce the center and potentially swing the rook to the kingside or d-file for future action. This move develops the bishop to an active square, challenging white's knight on f3 and potentially preparing to castle kingside. This move solidifies the pawn structure, preparing to reinforce the d4 square and potentially support a future push of the d-pawn, while also opening a diagonal for the queen to potentially redeploy. This move, h6, is a prophylactic measure to prevent the knight on b3 or the bishop on d3 from executing a dangerous discovered attack or harassment on g5, while also preparing to expand on the kingside. This move directly challenges black's bishop on g4, forcing a decision and potentially disrupting black's coordination. This move seeks to exchange black's light-squared bishop for white's knight, potentially opening the h-file for counterplay and creating a more favorable pawn structure for black in the center. This move develops the bishop to an active square, preparing to castle queenside and potentially supporting a central pawn push or exchange. Castling kingside consolidates the king and prepares to connect the rooks, a standard maneuver after developing the minor pieces and securing the king's safety. This exchange of bishops aims to disrupt black's pawn structure by creating doubled pawns and potentially freeing white's pieces for greater activity. The recapture of the pawn with the queen re-establishes material equality and clarifies the pawn structure, while also maintaining central influence and preparing to challenge white's active pieces. This move centralizes the queen, supporting the pawn on b6 and preparing for potential advances on the queenside or in the center, while coordinating with the knight on b3. This move prepares to contest the open d-file, reinforcing the central pawn and potentially supporting a future d4 push to challenge white's central control and activate the rook. Rad1 aims to occupy the open d-file, contesting control and preparing to exert pressure on black's d5 pawn. This move aims to challenge white's pieces and potentially gain queenside space, but it weakens the queenside pawn structure and can allow white's knight to establish a strong outpost on b5. This move aims to reposition the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially supporting a future kingside attack or preparing to exchange it for black's strong knight on c6. This move exchanges white's most active bishop, removing a key defender of the kingside and opening the g-file for potential queen activity. Recapturing with the queen opens lines and eyes the d5 pawn, preparing for potential pressure on that central square. This aggressive pawn push on the queenside challenges white's knight and aims to exploit the weakened c3 pawn, potentially opening lines for black's rook. This knight maneuver aims to reposition the knight to a more active central square, potentially attacking black's queenside pawn or supporting an eventual e4-e5 pawn break. This move recaptures the pawn but brings the queen into a potentially vulnerable position on the queenside, inviting tactical complications. This move initiates a decisive exchange, sacrificing a pawn to gain a significant structural advantage by creating doubled pawns for black on the c-file and opening the b-file for white's rook. This move recaptures the pawn, but allows white to strengthen their central pawn presence and potentially open lines for attack. With the subsequent removal of the knight, this move strategically repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing potential threats on the queenside and supporting a future advance of the d-pawn. This pawn push is a crucial defensive maneuver to prevent white's knight from attacking the kingside, aiming to maintain kingside pawn integrity while preparing for counterplay on the queenside. This move initiates a powerful attack on black's queenside by exploiting the pressure on the c-file and threatening to infiltrate with the queen. This move prepares to reinforce the kingside and potentially launch a counterattack on the queenside, while also defending against white's strong queen and rook pressure. This move, bf5, is a critical positional maneuver aimed at disrupting black's coordination and creating attacking chances by targeting the weak pawn on g6 and potentially opening lines towards the king. This move initiates a critical rook maneuver, aiming to challenge white's control of the open e-file and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the queenside. This rook exchange simplifies the position and aims to resolve black's initiative on the queenside, while also removing a key defender of the 8th rank. This capture on e7 directly addresses white's aggressive rook on the 7th rank, clearing the way for black's remaining knight to become more active and potentially contest control of the d5 square. The bishop repositions to a more active diagonal on d3, aiming to contest the a6-f1 diagonal and potentially support an advance on the kingside. The knight's return to f5 aims to contest the outpost on d4 and potentially create threats against white's king, as well as freeing the e7 square for the rook. This exchange removes a key defensive piece for black and opens lines that white can exploit to pressure the weak pawn on g6. This recapture on f5 is a critical moment, as it resolves the doubled pawns but creates a permanent weakness on the kingside that white can target with piece play and potential pawn breaks. The rook's redeployment to the e-file prepares to contest the open file, aiming to exchange pieces and exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure. This move, taking the pawn on a2, is a tactical blunder that allows white to win material through a discovered attack and subsequent queen capture. This move sacrifices the queen to force a favorable material exchange, aiming to simplify into an endgame where white's extra pawn on the kingside becomes decisive. This pawn move advances to attack the rook on a2, forcing white's queen to move and potentially creating counterplay for black on the queenside. This move forces black to choose between moving their king to a potentially more exposed position, or blocking the check with a piece that will likely be lost. This move strategically repositions the king to safety behind the pawns, anticipating white's potential king hunt and preparing to defend the weak f7 pawn. This move forces black's king to a more vulnerable square, consolidating white's material advantage and preparing for a decisive attack. The move recaptures the bishop, but allows white's queen to become very active and potentially threaten the king. After a tense exchange of pieces, white recaptures the pawn and maintains attacking pressure on black's exposed king, aiming to exploit the open files. This move aims to centralize the queen and target white's doubled pawns on the d-file, while also creating potential mating threats and offering a pawn sacrifice for activity. This move brings the rook to the 7th rank, a strategically advantageous position, to restrict black's king and potentially support a decisive pawn push or exploit weaknesses on the back rank. This move aims to activate the rook on the f-file, creating potential threats against white's king and the bishop on e3, while also preparing to support a central pawn push or consolidate the position. This aggressive queen sortie forces the black king into a perpetual check or a sacrifice, aiming to simplify the position favorably by exploiting the vulnerable black king. This move continues to navigate the complex attacking position, seeking to consolidate the king's safety by moving away from the open file and potential checks from the powerful white queen. This move, re5, aims to activate the rook onto the 5th rank, creating pressure and potentially supporting a breakthrough on the kingside or controlling key squares. This move attempts to centralize the queen and prepare for potential counterplay against white's king, but it allows white's rook to become very active on the 7th rank, creating significant threats. This move, rh5, aims to attack the undefended black queen on h6, forcing it to move and likely disrupting black's coordination while white consolidates their advantage. This move prepares to support the rook on a8 with the king, aiming to solidify the queenside and potentially create counterplay along the open a-file. This check forces the black king to a more exposed position and allows white to maintain material equality while creating further attacking threats. The king is actively seeking refuge on the 7th rank, and this move aims to prevent immediate threats from the white queen and rook while maintaining a defensive posture. This capture on h6 decisively wins a pawn and exposes black's king, initiating a winning endgame by eliminating a key defender and creating mating threats. The capture of the rook with the king is a necessary move to avoid immediate material loss. But it leaves black's king exposed and white poised to further exploit the open lines and attack. The move forces black's king to a more exposed square, allowing white to continue the attack and exploit the weakened kingside. With the material equal and queens off the board, the game transitions into a pawn endgame where king activity is paramount. So bringing the king closer to the center is crucial for defensive and offensive potential. This check forces the black king back, consolidating white's material advantage and preparing to utilize the open files for the rook. With white's king now exposed, black's primary objective is to transition into an endgame where the king's centralization and the opposition can be leveraged, despite the material deficit. This move capitalizes on black's weakened kingside pawn structure and advances the queen to create immediate threats against the exposed black king and potentially secure further material.